Star Wars 7x7, episode 2312. Today we are going to pursue a couple of dozen tropes and secret references and Easter eggs inside this episode of The Mandalorian. This first episode, Season 2, Episode 1, also Chapter 9, The Marshal. Punch it. Hey Rebel Rouser, I'm Alan Voivod, and this is Star Wars 7x7, your daily dose of Star Wars joy. And thank you so much for joining me for it. So we're going to try and go through these as quickly as possible, so that way we can keep this still within the reasonable length of the podcast. I'll start off with the planet where the Mandalorian and the child arrive to meet with Gor Koresh. So far, we still don't know what planet that is and what city that is, anything like that. I was looking at the graffiti for surprises, information, and whatnot. Couldn't really pull a lot of it, but the door by which the Mandalorian enters to where the fights are going on, there is white lettering on one side, and it reads Lifer for some reason, which doesn't seem to resonate with anything inside Star Wars canon that we know about, or even legends. Like the word Lifer didn't necessarily come up anywhere, but might be something to watch for a little bit later, perhaps. Secondly, Gor Koresh is an Abyssin, which is a character that was first seen in A New Hope in the Cantina scene, and they've finally brought one back for another live-action appearance. Later on in that scene, when the Mandalorian gets him zip-lined and tied up with his little cable, that is actually almost a repeat of what happens in the opening of the very first episode of The Mandalorian, funnily enough, when he does that to a Quarren character and starts dragging him back too. So it's an interesting parallel. And then Gor Koresh says that he swears on the Gotra, and that line is just treated as a throwaway, where the Gotra refers to the droid Gotra, which is a group that advocates for droid rights, but also is a bit of a scoundrels group to begin with. It is a crime syndicate, and we actually first hear the droid Gotra in canon, I believe, in Most Wanted, which is the prequel novel to Solo: A Star Wars Story by Ray Carson. So that's an interesting point to know, that the Gotra is still active in 10 ABY, which would be 20 years later, something like that. Also, Mando says, in response to hearing that there's a Mandalorian on Tatooine, he said, "I've spent much time on Tatooine," and he didn't know of anyone there. That might explain, finally, why it is that the Mandalorian is able to communicate so readily with the Tusken Raiders, and as we find out in this episode, he's actually able to speak their language. It isn't just sign language that he uses like he does in Season 1. But that opens up one big question, which we'll get to in a moment. Moving on, and we saw this droid last season as well, but in the Hangar 3-5 on Tatooine, the droid that comes up to show the Mandalorian the map of Tatooine, that is R5-D4. That is the droid that Uncle Owen tried to buy at the very beginning of A New Hope that blew its motivator, and apparently is still working now just fine. The town where this supposed Mandalorian is a town called Mos Pelgo. Mos Pelgo actually first appeared in, oh my gosh, Star Wars The Old Republic Knights of the Eternal Throne, and that dates back thousands of years. So basically it was ultimately wiped out, I guess, and came back as a mining town, and then it was taken over by the mining collective. At least that's how it's told to us in the episode, but in Aftermath, in the novels by Chuck Wendig, it's actually the Red Key Company, which is a front mining company for the Red Key Raiders, which is a criminal group. And sticking with that, then you have, of course, Cobb Vanth, who also appeared in the Aftermath novels, and yesterday we talked about the difference in the story of him getting the armor versus what happened in the Aftermath novels, and it's basically a similar situation with this Red Key versus the mining collective. There's a bit of an alteration in the story there as well, and I'm sure that there will be some clarification made down the line about how those stories can be the same and different, but we just haven't gotten it yet. And another note, Freetown is actually Mos Pelgo. Freetown is the name of the place where Cobb Vanth was acting as a protector in the Aftermath novels, but it is now been renamed to its ancient name, if you will, which is Mos Pelgo. And the Mandalorian's arrival in Mos Pelgo is very Western trope related. And just to pick one High Plains drifter, when Clint Eastwood comes into the town of Lago, when he's riding into town and there are townspeople staring at him from, decks and, porches and whatnot, just looking at him coming in suspiciously and whatnot. Very Western style trope to deliver. As for the Krayt Dragon, well, first of all, we saw a skeleton of a Krayt Dragon in New Hope, naturally, so it ties back to that. And the fact that it can swim under the sand is a, tie to both Tremors, that 1990 sort of horror spoofy kind of movie, and also Dune, which was an inspiration for George Lucas as well, with the sandworms that can burrow and move around underneath the sand. Later on, when Cobb Vanth and the Mandalorian go to see where the Krayt Dragon is living, they are riding on speeders, and it looks like, suspiciously, like the speeder that Cobb Vanth is using is one where a sidecar is basically attached to a pod racing engine, and darned if that pod racing engine doesn't look like one of young Anakin Skywalker's pod racing engines. Then later, when they go with the Tusken Raiders for the first time to the Krayt Dragon's lair, they stake out a bantha for the Krayt Dragon to eat. And that's very reminiscent of the goat bait scene in Jurassic Park, where they stake out the goat for the Tyrannosaurus Rex to eat. And it mysteriously disappears because, there's a lot of other stuff going on and nobody actually sees him eat the thing. But they kind of turn this one on its head by staking out the bantha, and instead it's the Tusken Raider that gets eaten. Going back, one I forgot to tell you about in the flashback for what happened with the mining collective. First of all, I've been trying, and I'm not completely successful yet at decoding what the Arabesh is on the news broadcast with the hologram of the Death Star blowing up. But what I have gotten is that it says, on a new armored space station, even, and then there's other words cycling around. I haven't decoded the whole thing yet, but it's coming across. So there's that. And then when Cobb Vanth in Mandalorian armor starts taking on the mining collective and driving them out, his tilting over and launching of the rocket from his backpack, that has to be a note about the fact that Boba Fett is supposed to be able to do that. The action figure originally was supposed to do that, and then, of course, because that was considered a safety thing, it wasn't able to do that when it came out, but it sure seems like a wink and a nod to that idea. Later on, going back to the thread chronologically of the story, when the townspeople and the Banthas go to face the Krayt Dragon once and for all. The Banthas are riding in single file to hide their numbers, which is good fun. And during the fight, the Mandalorian gives a whack at the jetpack of Cobb Vanth, which sends him flying out of control, which is definitely a wink and a nod to Boba Fett's backpack getting whacked by Han Solo. Boba Fett, where? Boink! And sending him crazy flying too. Then there's the thing about blowing up the Krayt Dragon from the inside. This has shown up, I guess, in movies and comics and anime and stuff like that. I think a reasonably well-known example would be in Men in Black, when Will Smith gets swallowed by a bug, for example. There's, almost a tie back to the Exogorth and the Millennium Falcon being swallowed by it, except they're not blowing it up, obviously. And I guess in Tremors, if I'm not terribly mistaken, the way that they blew up these graboids, which were the worms that were underneath the sand, was by putting explosives into them. A couple more things about the Krayt Dragon, and then we will be done. First of all, if you've ever wondered which would win in a fight, the Krayt Dragon versus the Sarlacc, well, we have our answer from this episode. It is the Krayt Dragon, because it has taken over a Sarlacc pit, and the only way it could have done that is if it ate the Sarlacc. But one of the things that's being debated about online is whether this is the Sarlacc pit where we saw the climactic Jabba the Hutt battle in Return of the Jedi, and I have to say, I suppose it's possible, but the geography around that Sarlacc pit in The Mandalorian versus the geography around the Sarlacc pit in Return of the Jedi, it doesn't look the same. It looks like rockier and more canyon-like around this one in The Mandalorian than it did in Return of the Jedi. That one looked very much more dune-like and open sands and whatnot. So, I suppose we could find out something different, but at this point, at least for me, it does not seem like it's the same Sarlacc pit, and there's more than one Sarlacc on Tatooine, so yeah, there's that. And then, finally, when the Tusken Raiders are digging into the dead crate dragon and they find that giant round thing, not an egg, it's a pearl. It's a pearl in the stomach of a crate dragon, which is very rare, very valuable. And if I'm reading Wikipedia right, it only would have formed if it had been inside of a rock that the crate dragon ate that had a kyber crystal in the rock. From the stuff I read, it sounds like they eat rocks to help with their digestion, but that if they eat a rock that contains a kyber crystal, that the acids in their body work on that and basically polish it and refine it. And that one seems pretty darn big, so I don't think it could be used in a lightsaber. But apparently, according to Wikipedia, they can be used in lightsabers, and they create this bizarre howling sound when activated. This is due to a book called Gadgets and Gear or something like that. So that's that. Now, I hinted at something about The Mandalorian earlier that I said I would follow up on, and I'm going to do that in just a second. Before I do, though, this is just sort of a public service announcement thing. Election Day in the US is on Tuesday, November 3rd, and I've seen so many different websites advertised talking about where to go vote and making a plan to vote and all that, and I don't even know if I feel comfortable recommending one or another or over the other. I suppose probably one of the safe ways to do it is if you know that you're going to vote Democrat or you know that you're going to vote Republican, probably you could go to the website for Biden or the website for Trump and find voting information through them. But I'm going to recommend that you check with your city or town's clerk's office, your town clerk, your tax collector, or your Secretary of State's office, and look for voting information there. I think it's important to vote in general, but I do think, like a lot of the talk has been going on, that this may be one of the most important votes in our lifetimes. And so please, please do not stay on the sidelines. Please vote. And if you are trying to submit absentee ballots or mail-in ballots, at this point, it's probably too late for the post office to deliver them. So see if you can deliver them in person to your local town clerk, tax collector, whoever it is that is handling that for you. Look online for your city or town, and good luck and stay safe. So the thing about The Mandalorian, the door that's sort of been opened and hasn't yet been walked through, is the fact that if he says he spent a lot of time on Tatooine, well, what does that actually mean? I mean, for example, we know that he was rescued by Death Watch on a planet that has nothing to do with Tatooine. We know that he was brought up in the Fighting Corps. We know that eventually Tatooine fell victim to the Empire. And we know there was a great purge. We know that Mandalorians were on the run, but we don't know when he went to Tatooine. The fact that he spent a lot of time on Tatooine suggests that there was a covert there at one point, and he was certainly surprised to find out that there was a Mandalorian there, and he never thought that there were. So does that mean that there had been a covert that eventually left at some point? Or is it a situation where he was on his own for a while and, somehow managed to eventually go to Navarro and hook up with a Mandalorian covert there? Still a lot of unanswered questions, but as a result, Tatooine now becomes more important to the story of the Mandalorian himself, and therefore is probably becoming more important for the Mandalorian, the series. And so that ominous shot of Boba Fett at the end of the episode, well, maybe that means that we haven't seen the last of Tatooine or the lost of Boba Fett either. And that is going to do it for our look at a couple of dozen secret references and tropes and Easter eggs from Season 2, Episode 1, The Marshal, Chapter 9 of The Mandalorian. And that's going to do it for this episode of the show. Thank you so much for joining me for it as always, and may the Force be with you wherever in the world you may be.
Star Wars 7x7 is not endorsed or sponsored yet by Lucasfilm Limited, Disney, or 20th Century Fox, and is intended for entertainment and information purposes only. Star Wars, the Star Wars logo, all names and pictures of Star Wars characters, vehicles, and any other Star Wars-related items are registered trademarks and/or copyrights of Lucasfilm Limited or their respective trademark and copyright holders. May the Force be with them. All original content is copyright 2020 by Star Wars 7x7. We hope you love it.